It was just past midnight when the wounded biker stumbled into the emergency room, blood soaking through his jacket and pain tightening every breath he took. Yet even in that moment, the nurses noticed something unusual about him. He wasn't afraid for himself. He wasn't asking for help. Instead, he kept repeating one thing with staggering determination. He refused to leave his friend behind. That single sentence, spoken with the weight of loyalty stronger than fear, was enough to make everyone around him freeze. Something deeper was unfolding, something far more powerful than an injury. Before passing out, the biker struggled to give the doctors a name, gasping that his friend was still out there on the dark roadside where the accident had happened. And even as the room spun and his vision dimmed, he tried to pull himself off the gurney, desperate to go back. The nurses had to hold him down gently, promising they would send someone, promising his friend would not be left alone in the night. But the look in the biker's eyes revealed a story bigger than the moment, one built on years of brotherhood, shared roads and promises that could never be broken. As he lost consciousness, word quietly spread among the riders who knew him, riders who understood the kind of bond that cannot be explained to anyone outside their world. A few phone calls were made, a few messages were sent, and in a matter of minutes, the story of the wounded biker's refusal to abandon his friend traveled through the biker community like a spark in dry grass. What had happened was tragic, yes, but what he had done, even while bleeding and barely able to stand, struck every rider with a truth they lived by. No one is ever left behind. By sunrise, an extraordinary scene was beginning to form outside the hospital. Engines echoed through the early morning chill as riders from different towns, different states, and different stories arrived one after another. Some drove through the night without stopping. Others left work, left sleep, or left plans without hesitation. They came because loyalty demanded it. They came because the biker inside had shown a level of devotion that deserved to be honored. And they came because, in their world, brotherhood doesn't end at pain. It begins there. When the doctor finally stepped outside to breathe in the cold morning air, he froze in disbelief. Parked in perfect silence, filling the entire hospital entrance and extending far down the street, were more than 200 bikers. Not shouting, not crowding, not demanding anything, just waiting, shoulders squared, eyes steady, engines quiet. They had come for their brother. They had come for the friend he refused to abandon. And now, they were refusing to leave him alone. Inside the dim hospital room, the wounded biker drifted in and out of consciousness, unaware of the gathering outside. Machines beeped steadily beside him, but his breathing remained restless, as if his mind was still trapped on the dark road where everything had gone wrong. Nurses whispered that he should be resting, but even in his weakened state, he kept asking about his friend. He needed to know if someone had gone back. He needed to know if the man who had ridden beside him for years was alive. That unbreakable loyalty pulsed through every strained breath he took, revealing the depth of the bond that had brought him here. Meanwhile, the doctors searched for information about the missing friend, but the night had been foggy and the accident site remote. Hours had passed since the crash. The unknown weighed heavily over the room, and with every moment of silence, the biker's anxiety deepened. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of failing the man he had sworn to protect. His voice trembled when he whispered that they had ridden through storms together, through deserts, through nights far darker than this one. He kept repeating that you never abandon a rider, not even when the road grows cruel. As the early morning light filtered through the blinds, the biker's condition began to stabilize, but his heart remained unsettled. He tried again to pull himself out of bed, but the pain forced him back down. The doctor urged him to rest, promising they were doing everything they could. Yet the biker's eyes remained fixed on the door, as though he were waiting for someone familiar to walk through it, or perhaps fearing that no one would. His loyalty had become a weight he refused to put down, a reminder of who he was even in the face of agony. Outside, more riders arrived, each one parking in complete silence before joining the line. Some folded their arms, others clasped their hands behind their backs, but all of them stood with the same unwavering resolve. They weren't there out of curiosity or obligation. They were there because one of their own had bled for his brother, had fought against pain to protect him. That kind of loyalty demanded a response. It called to something deep within every rider who heard the story, awakening memories of times when they themselves had needed help and someone had answered. By the time the sun rose fully above the hospital roof, the crowd of riders had become an unshakable force of unity. Nurses peered through the windows, whispering in astonishment at the sight. No one caused a disturbance. No one tried to force their way inside. They simply waited, their presence speaking louder than any words could. Inside, the wounded biker still had no idea what was happening just beyond the glass. That more than 200 people had arrived, not for drama, not for spectacle, but to make sure he and his friend were not alone. When the doctor finally stepped outside to address the crowd, he approached cautiously, unaccustomed to the sight of so many riders standing shoulder to shoulder in absolute silence. Their presence wasn't aggressive, but it carried a weight that demanded respect. He cleared his throat and told them the truth. They had found only one man at the crash site. The friend's condition was still unknown. A ripple of emotion passed through the group. Not panic, but a collective tightening, as if every heart flinched at the same time. Yet no one spoke. They simply listened, every face determined, every jaw set. Several riders exchanged solemn glances. They knew what it meant to lose someone on the road, to watch a brother's tail light disappear into darkness and never return. Memories surfaced in their expressions. Memories of close calls, accidents, nights spent searching miles of highway in the rain. Their hearts carried stories of survival and loss. And for them, this situation was not just another incident. It was personal. It was a reminder of how fragile life becomes when asphalt turns treacherous and time becomes a cruel enemy. The doctor sensed the emotional tension and assured them that search teams were expanding the radius, determined to locate the missing friend. He explained that the injured biker inside had fought tooth and nail not to be separated from him, despite his own injuries. Those words struck the riders deeply. They understood the gravity of that act, because in their world, there is nothing more sacred than refusing to leave a brother behind. Every rider felt that truth settle heavily in their chest. Inside the hospital, the wounded biker stirred again, sensing movement beyond his door even before hearing the whisper of footsteps. He didn't know that the hallway outside his room had grown quiet because nurses and doctors kept walking back and forth, glancing through the windows at the sea of bikes gathered below. He didn't know that the loyalty he had shown, the kind that keeps a person upright even when the body collapses, had inspired a wave of riders who now stood like guardians outside the building. His determination had rippled outward, touching hearts he didn't even know were listening. As the morning stretched on, a subtle shift seemed to pass through the crowd outside. It wasn't fear. It wasn't frustration. It was resolve, a collective agreement that they would stay for as long as necessary. They were no longer waiting for news. They were standing watch, honoring their brother's loyalty by offering their own. And with every passing minute, their presence became a testament to something few people ever get to witness. A community that stands together not out of convenience, but out of love, respect, and the unspoken promise that no one rides alone. Back inside the hospital, the wounded biker finally regained enough clarity to ask for a phone. His voice was coarse, strained, and weak, but the urgency behind it made the nurse hesitate before gently telling him it was still too early for calls. He tried to push himself up, wincing as pain radiated through his ribs, but he refused to stay still. His mind was fixed on one thought. If his friend was out there alone, every second mattered. Even through the haze of medication, his loyalty burned through him like a pulse, stronger than the aches tearing through his body. The nurse eventually relented, not because he insisted, but because she saw something in his eyes that softened her restraint. She handed him the phone with a warning to keep it brief. His trembling hands dialed the number of one of the riders he trusted most. When the call connected, the biker barely managed to ask if there was news of the friend before his voice cracked. Hearing that 200 riders were outside the hospital stunned him into silence. For a moment, he couldn't speak. His throat tightened as he realized that the loyalty he had shown had multiplied far beyond what he imagined. On the other end of the call, the rider spoke calmly, telling him to rest, telling him the community had his back now. They would not leave, not until both brothers were accounted for. The wounded biker pressed the phone against his ear, closing his eyes as tears gathered at the corners. It wasn't the pain making him emotional. It was the overwhelming weight of knowing that his loyalty had been met with loyalty. In their world, that kind of reciprocity wasn't common. It was sacred, and it gave him a strength he had nearly lost in the chaos of the night. As he handed the phone back to the nurse, his shoulders eased for the first time since the accident. The knowledge that his brothers were outside, standing in silence beneath the morning sky, wrapped him in a sense of protection no medicine could provide. He sank into the pillows, breathing slowly, allowing the truth to settle inside him. He was not alone. His friend was not abandoned. The Brotherhood was out there searching, waiting, enduring, just as he would have for any of them. That realization steadied him more than any morphine drip. Meanwhile, outside the hospital, the riders' patience did not waver. They formed a silent semicircle around the entrance, creating a living shield of presence and unity. Strangers who had never met before exchanged nods of understanding, bound together by a shared purpose. Even those who usually rode alone felt a pull toward the group, reminded that some moments require unity rather than solitude. The air seemed thicker with meaning, as if the entire hospital had become a place suspended between fear and hope. As the day progressed, search teams expanded their efforts, combing deeper into the wooded areas near the crash site. Several riders asked to join, but the authorities insisted they stay back until the terrain was evaluated. Though frustrated, the riders understood. They weren't there to get in the way. They were there to stand firm. So they waited, forming an unmoving line along the hospital sidewalk like sentinels carved from the very asphalt they rode upon. Their silence was not emptiness. It was strength waiting to be called upon. Inside, the wounded biker's restlessness returned. Images of the accident flashed in his mind. The curve in the road, the screech of tires, the moment he felt his friend's bike veer off into darkness. He remembered shouting, but the crash had swallowed their voices, leaving only the sound of metal against earth. The guilt pressed down on him with unbearable weight. If he had reacted faster, if he had seen the danger sooner, maybe things would be different. He clenched the sheets tightly, fighting the fear that his friend might be lying somewhere, still waiting for help. A doctor entered quietly, sensing the turmoil. He pulled a chair closer and told the biker that search teams were doing everything possible. He reminded him that he had survived a fall that could have taken his life, and that his friend had likely survived too. The doctor didn't sugarcoat the situation. He simply balanced honesty with hope, a combination the biker desperately needed. The reassurance steadied him, if only for a moment. He nodded weakly but kept his eyes fixed on the door, as though determined to will his friend into existence. Outside, the riders remained motionless until a distant police radio crackled louder than usual. Several heads turned instinctively. A few steps were taken toward the parking lot where the officers were coordinating the search. The air shifted, not with fear, but with anticipation. Something had changed. Conversations hushed. Boots scraped lightly against concrete. The silence grew even deeper, as if the entire street held its breath. Whatever news was coming would either break them or lift them, and every rider felt the weight of that uncertainty. Though no one yet knew what the officers had discovered, one thing was certain: the riders would not leave. Whether the news brought relief or heartbreak, they were united in purpose, rooted in the promise that no brother would be abandoned. Their presence was a force, quiet, unwavering, unbreakable. And inside the hospital, the wounded biker felt it like a heartbeat outside his window, steady and strong, reminding him that loyalty didn't fade in darkness. If anything, it burned brighter there. A few minutes later, two officers approached the hospital entrance with expressions that were serious but not grim. The riders stiffened instinctively, forming a tighter line without needing to speak. The lead officer requested to meet with the medical staff first, and a nurse guided him inside. The tension outside became almost tangible. Some riders clasped their hands behind their backs. Others took slow, steady breaths, bracing themselves for the truth. No one dared to assume the worst, but no one assumed the best either. They simply waited, grounded by the shared belief that whatever came next, they would face it together. Inside the hospital, the officer explained that they had found signs of the missing biker: a torn piece of clothing snagged on a branch, deep tire marks leading off the main road, and footprints heading toward a lower incline. These details suggested survival. The wounded biker listened intently, gripping the side of his bed as Hope fought through the fog of exhaustion. When the officer mentioned that search teams believe the friend had attempted to walk for help, the biker's breath caught in his throat. It was exactly what his friend would have done, always pushing forward, always fighting to stay alive. The relief, however, was tangled with fear. If his friend had survived the crash, but was injured, he could be anywhere in the dense terrain, vulnerable and alone. The officer assured them that a more focused search was underway, and helicopters were being brought in to cover the areas too difficult to reach on foot. The wounded biker felt a flicker of gratitude, knowing that the urgency came not only from protocol, but from the overwhelming presence of 200 riders outside, demanding resolution simply by standing there. As soon as the officer left the room, the biker let out a shaky breath, his shoulders trembling under the weight of emotion he could no longer suppress. He stared at the ceiling, whispering a quiet plea for his friend's safety. Memories flooded his mind. Long rides under star-filled skies, conversations shared through helmet radios, laughter echoing across empty highways. These moments were not just memories. They were promises. Promises that neither of them would ever face the road alone. And now, more than ever, he hoped those promises still held true. Outside, the riders sensed a shift when the officer eventually returned to brief the group. Though they couldn't hear the details, the subtle softening of his posture told them the news carried a trace of hope. A few riders exchanged glances filled with cautious optimism. Their engines remained silent, their bodies still, but their hearts beat with renewed determination. If the missing biker was out there fighting to survive, then their presence here was not in vain. They would wait as long as needed, through noon, through dusk, through nightfall if necessary. Leaving was not an option. As the day stretched further into afternoon, a gentle breeze rustled through the rows of parked motorcycles, making the hanging keychains and metal tags clink softly in the wind. The sound was almost melodic, like a lullaby whispered by iron and chrome. Several hospital visitors stopped to watch, struck by the sheer devotion displayed by the riders. Some snapped photos, others whispered in awe, but the bikers paid little attention. Their mission was simple, silent, and unwavering. Stand guard until both brothers were accounted for. Inside the hospital, the wounded biker drifted into a restless sleep, clutching the thin blanket in his fists. His dreams were filled with the crash, the skid, the darkness, the moment he lost sight of his friend's headlight. But now, woven into those images, came the faint sense of hope. He saw faces, dozens of them, standing outside the hospital in the soft morning light. He saw helmets lined like soldiers and bikes arranged with precision. He saw unity where once there had been only fear. That vision steadied him, even in his unconscious mind. As dusk approached, the riders lit the first small vigil candles along the sidewalk, their soft flames flickering against the growing shadow of evening. They didn't speak, but the gesture carried a powerful message. The missing biker was not forgotten. Not for a moment. Passers-by felt the atmosphere shift, touched by the quiet resilience of men and women who refused to let darkness erase someone they cared about. The candles reflected in their eyes like tiny beacons, each one a vow to keep waiting, to keep believing, to keep holding space for hope. One rider stepped forward and placed a photo on the concrete, a picture of the missing biker smiling beside his motorcycle on a bright summer day. The wounded biker's closest friend in the group had brought it, his hands trembling slightly as he set it down. That small image carried years of memories, stories, and laughter. It reminded everyone of why they were there, not just to honor loyalty, but to honor the human being behind the handlebars, a man whose presence had shaped their journeys in ways only riders could understand. And so the evening settled in, with the riders forming a silent barrier of strength beneath the gentle glow of candlelight. The hospital windows reflected their silhouettes like unwavering shadows. No one knew when news would come, or what it would bring, but every rider present had made the same unspoken promise. They would not leave until their brother was found. And inside the hospital room, the wounded biker slept with a fragile but undeniable certainty that he was surrounded by a family forged on the road, a family strong enough to face the night with him. When the officers finally walked toward the hospital entrance, The riders straightened instinctively, their eyes locked onto every step. The lead officer carried a tone of urgency, but also of reassurance, telling them that the missing biker had been found alive. The words spread through the crowd like a shockwave, not loud, not dramatic, but deeply felt. Many closed their eyes in relief. Others bowed their heads, overwhelmed by the weight lifting from their chests. Their long, silent vigil had not been in vain. Hope, which had hovered fragile in the morning light, now stood firm. Inside the hospital, the wounded biker was told the news. For a moment, he didn't react. He simply stared at the doctor, trying to understand that the nightmare he had replayed endlessly in his mind was finally over. Then, slowly, tears gathered in his eyes as the truth sank in. His friend was alive. Hurt, yes, exhausted, shaken, bruised, but alive. A lifetime of rides flashed through his mind. Nights under open skies, roads that stretched beyond the horizon, promises exchanged without needing words. And now, the promise had been kept once more. He had not left his friend behind. When the two friends were finally reunited, the moment was quiet and deeply human. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic outbursts, just two men holding onto each other, battered but present, grateful that fate had given them a second chance. Around them, nurses paused to watch, and even the doctors softened their voices. The bond between the two riders was something that didn't need explaining. It was written in the way they embraced, in the relief that trembled through their breath, in the gratitude that filled the room like sunlight after a long storm. Outside, the riders slowly remounted their bikes, the engines rumbling back to life like a heartbeat reawakening. They didn't celebrate. They didn't need to. Their presence had spoken louder than any words could. They had shown what loyalty looks like when tested, what unity becomes in the face of fear, and how powerful it is when people stand together for something bigger than themselves. As they rode away in a long, steady line, each one carried with them a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that brotherhood is not a word, but an action lived every single day. If this story moved you or made you reflect on loyalty, courage, and the power of standing by the people who matter, take a moment to support this channel. Your like, your comment, and your subscription help bring stories like this one to even more people who need to hear them. Join our community, share your thoughts, and help us continue creating powerful narratives that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Your presence here makes all the difference.